have over 1.6 million members across the country. Here in Ohio, we have over 58,000 members. What we do is essentially the same things you guys do. We educate people and we motivate them and mobilize them as advocates for free markets and limited government and fiscal responsibility in government. And Ohio 180 is our project this year to make sure that we turn Ohio around. Because if you look at, and we have some slides on this, and I'm going to be talking, this is going to be policy and grassroots training. We're going to be talking about some of the policy changes we need to make this year, and then talk a little bit about the best ways to advocate for those changes. And then most of you guys, I'm sure, probably know former state representative Seth Morgan, who ran in the primary for auditor. So a lot of people know him. He's always been great on these issues, is an expert on many of them, and who better to explain how to affect how to convince your legislator to vote a certain way than someone who was just a legislator up until a few weeks ago. So, do we have it going yet? No. All right. If you look back to 1960, Ohioans were more prosperous than almost 3/4 of the rest of the country. However, today, Ohioans are less prosperous than 2/3 of the rest of the country. People used to come here for jobs and prosperity. Now, unfortunately, people are leaving for jobs and prosperity. And some of the slides I'm going to show in a minute, if we can get this going, show that what happened over the last several years is that our government just got really big and our taxes went really high. And the amount of private sector growth is not in line with the amount of government growth. Government growth has been much larger. So what we need to do in 2011 is we need to turn Ohio around. Government needs to become smaller, and we need to become more efficient and effective. And a lot of that is going to be part of the budget process. You guys probably know that Governor Kasich is required by law to announce his budget or give it to the legislature by March the 15th. So that's going to be coming out soon. And then the legislature has to approve that, and Governor Kasich has to sign it by the end of June of this year. I understand there is some precedent for that going a little longer, but it's supposed to be done by the end of June. So pretty much from now until the end of June, we're going to have a lot of policy fights that we're going to need people to engage in. As a matter of fact, I'm hearing that what we've been seeing at the Capitol is nothing compared to what's going to happen when the budget comes out March 15th. So we need to be ready to be able to react. Do we have it? So I'll talk a little bit about, I'll show you the slides when we get them up, but taxes, for example, here in Ohio, about 40 years ago, we were the 5th lowest taxed state in the union. Now we are the 8th highest taxed state. And the Tax Foundation, is it the Tax Foundation? Which tax group is it? It is. The Tax Foundation every year does something that they call the Corporate Tax Index. And they take about 100 factors and they look at the different states and compare them to see who is the friendliest tax environment for businesses. Ohio ranks 46th worst on that. And the only states behind us are New York, New Jersey, California, and Connecticut. So we have a lot of improving to do. And there are some specific reforms that we need to be looking at this year, and Seth and I are both going to talk about them. I'm going to talk about the first 3, which are Senate Bill 5, and the fight for that one is long from over. We're also going to be talking about House Bill 3, which ends the death tax here in Ohio, and we're in the middle of that fight also. And I'm also going to talk about the HJR 2, which is the resolution that is similar to the Ohio Project petition that's been circulated. So I'm going to talk about those, and then Seth is going to talk some about education, corrections, Medicaid, public pensions, and then we're going to do some grassroots training, and we'll talk some about the handbook, and then Seth's going to give you some pointers for ways to get your message across to your legislator. Okay, we got it. Do we have it?
We got one.
Okay. Well, let's start with the 1. It's not working. Okay. Okay. So a lot of this I already went through, talking about how several years ago, people used to come for jobs and prosperity, and now they leave for jobs and prosperity. This just shows a graph of government spending and debt. And in a minute, I'm going to show you some information about population. Ohio's population over the last several years has been relatively stable. We've had, in about the last 5 years, about 105,000 people leave the state. However, the reason our population is relatively stable is because people can't decide where to be born. So we have births that are counteracting the fact that people are leaving. So if you look at the growth of our government debt, what you find is that there's really no reason for our debt to be growing, because it's not like we have more population that we need to serve. This is what I was the chart I was talking about, where it shows, see, personal income has only grown about 17%, but if you look at state debt and local debt, it's skyrocketed in the last few years. And again, population is not the cause of that. We all know that our job sector growth has been bad. And I already talked about the taxes. Now, the reason for Ohio 180 is that I personally believe that if we don't turn Ohio around between now and the end of June, it's probably not going to happen. Because what's going to happen is the conservative elected officials that we elected back in November, nothing will happen and they'll probably get voted out, and then we won't even have a chance at that point. So I think, you know, we only do the budget every 2 years. So it's got to happen now or it's not going to happen. So I'm going to start talking about Senate Bill 5. And as I'm sure you guys know, Senate Bill 5 passed the Senate yesterday, but it passed in a form that was different than originally introduced. And as a matter of fact, the omnibus amendment just came out about, I don't know, 5 or 6 o'clock on Tuesday night, and then it was passed the next day around 4:30. And so here are some of the highlights of what the bill does now. The bill originally got rid of collective bargaining for all state employees, but in the amendment and in the bill that was passed, they do still have collective bargaining. Just the overall general overview is, even though the bill, in my opinion, was significantly weakened by the amendment, it still is going to save Ohio. It's going to help with the budget deficit. It's still estimated to save $1.3 billion. So it's still worth it. It's still a good bill. The problems that I have with it and that AFP has with it is there are two specific reforms that are not in there that we think do need to be in there. And so when it goes to the House, we're going to advocate to try to get them in there. The first one is we believe that state employees should be able to choose whether or not they're in the union. They shouldn't be forced to be in a union. The second one is we believe that even if you are in the union, you should have a choice of whether your union dues are used for political purposes. So those are two things that we're going to be advocating for, and we'll be asking for help with in getting that done. Americans for Prosperity, throughout this whole process with Senate Bill 5, has been working very closely with the Ohio Liberty Council and other Tea Parties and Liberty organizations across the state, because we all have the same goal. Our goal is to bring jobs to Ohio, to make government smaller, to make us more competitive. So the highlights of the bills now are, the bill has removed the right to strike for all public employees, and there are penalties for participating in a strike. It establishes what can be bargained over and what cannot be bargained over. Specifically, the things that cannot be bargained over are health care benefits, pension pickups, privatization of services, workforce levels, and other similar provisions like that. This is the part, and you guys may have heard about Senator Seitz and Senator Gendell, who are both normally very conservative, voted against Senate Bill 5, and this is the part that they have the problem with. Used to, government entities, when they were negotiating, like local government entities, with the police and fire, for example, an arbitrator could come in, and the arbitrator could tell the city or the county how much money they had to pay the police or fire, whether the local government entity could afford it or not. So that doesn't make sense in the economy that we have now. And just as a general overview, the reason, and you guys probably understand this, the reason that we need collective bargaining reform in the first place is because during boom times, when things were really good, there were collective bargaining agreements that were agreed to that are just overly generous now. I mean, for example, in Cincinnati, there are 900 employees who are going to retire, and when they do, the city of Cincinnati is going to owe them about $93 million for unused holiday, vacation, and sick pay. It's not even pension. That's just unused days. And that averages out to about $100,000 an employee. I mean, that's something you're never going to get in the private sector now. And so what happened was, when the economy took a downturn, the Ohio and the local governments were not able to react to that the way a private employer could. And so we're not saying, you know, gee, we need to drastically change benefits and salaries and wages of public employees. What we're saying is Ohio needs the flexibility to effectively manage its workforce. We need to be able to react to economic ups and downs. We need an arbitrator not to be able to tell us how much money that we have to pay. We need to be able to hire and promote and pay based on merit, which under the current system you couldn't do. So this is just a mechanism to sort of level the playing field, because right now, if you look across the state, the Buckeye Institute did a study, it's called The Grand Bargain is Dead, that shows that in 85 out of 88 counties, the state employees make significantly more than their private sector counterparts. And the reason for that is these collective bargaining agreements. Jeff Birding, who's a Cincinnati City Council member, came and testified before the committee on Senate Bill 5, and he talked about how Cincinnati has a budget deficit, and a large portion of their budget is their workforce, and there's nothing they can do about it because there are these contracts that were negotiated before he was ever on city council, and there's nothing he can do about it now. So that's what this bill is trying to do. It's trying to address some of those things. It's trying to give the local government entity more power so that it can react like a private employer could. I mean, even a private employer that's unionized has more power, I would say, at this point than the government does. Because if you look at a private union, you know, they know that if they make too many demands, that they're going to make their company less competitive or maybe drive their company out of business. Whereas with a public union, they don't have that same concern because their company is the government, and the government can always go to the taxpayers for more taxes. So they can make as many demands as they want, and that's why you end up in a situation like in Cincinnati, where one employee who, when he retires, is going to get the equivalent of 3 years' salary in unused holiday, vacation, and sick days. Not even for pensions. So that's just completely out of whack with the private sector. So, you know, you're going to hear the union say that this is an attack on the middle class, or this is an attack on workers, and it's not. Because if you look at the percentage of people who are state employees, it's a tiny percentage of even the population of Ohio. So obviously it cannot be an attack on the middle class. I mean, we are the middle class. Most of the middle class doesn't work for the government. The unions are great at PR. And they've had a lot of people listen to them, but the fact is that that's not what it's about. So, okay, I'm sorry, I was getting to the part that Senator Seitz and Gradell had a problem with. So instead of an arbitrator now being able to tell the government entity how much they have to pay, what this bill does is it says that the employer and the employee can each make an offer. You know, the employer who is bargaining and the employee group union that is bargaining, they each make an offer, and if they can't agree, then they go to the legislative body, whether that be the city council or whether that be the school board, and then that legislative body has open hearings. And that's something that hasn't been true of the collective bargaining process before. It wasn't transparent. There wasn't a light shown on it. And that's what this bill, the goal of this bill is, because the senators who are in favor of this bill and vote for this bill believe that if you shine a light on the process and everybody sees what's going on, you're going to end up with a good deal. And so the legislative body then gets to choose whether they're going to accept the last offer of the employer or the last offer of the employee. Another thing that it does is it establishes public employee pay ranges. Before, pay was based on how long you'd been there, length of service. And then you had certain step raises built in just because you'd been there for a long time. And it wasn't based on merit or how well you were doing in your job. But under the new bill, it's going to be based on merit. They can still bargain over it, but there are pay ranges, and it's going to be based on merit, how much you get. It also, to resolve the issue of, you know, people being able to carry over 3 years equivalent of holiday, vacation, and sick leave, it's putting in specific limitations on sick days and things like that. It's going to allow collective bargaining agreements to be reopened for negotiation if there's a physical emergency of the entity, the government. And it also prohibits length of service from being one of the sole it prevents it from being the sole factor in determining layoffs. Because right now, you know, if they're going to be layoffs, they just lay off the people who were hired last, whether they are the best employees or not. So it's saying that you have to consider performance in layoffs. So it's definitely, I mean, it's a good reform. It's not as far as I had hoped it would go, but it is definitely worthwhile. It's something that we should get behind. And that's Americans for Prosperity's position. And my understanding is that in the House, hopefully it may get somewhat stronger. Specifically, I hope those two provisions that I talked about get in there. I believe, but I don't know, I've heard that the vote will probably be in the House, and they're probably going to try to get it signed before March 15th, which is when the governor is going to come out with his budget. And so we may have to do some more advocating in the House, although the House generally is more conservative than the Senate, so hopefully. Did you have a question?
Yeah, just on the same topic, who put those amendments in there? How did and because from my understanding, everyone was real happy with SB 5 before those amendments came in. Is there any way we could find out the names of the politicians that put those amendments in? Basically,
Seth will probably be able to answer better.
Shannon Jones, the original sponsor of the bill, is the one who introduced an omnibus, which means basically one package of amendments. She's the one that introduced the omnibus amendment to the bill. But I need to warn you that I think this whole thing was a compromise that was designed to try to ensure that they had enough votes. The bill passed by one vote out of the Senate. And so I think they were trying to make sure, I don't know that you can blame Senator Jones for the content of the omnibus. Now, you can blame her for carrying the omnibus amendment, but it was, I talked to one of the senators today, it was from their perspective necessary basically to keep one particular senator on board, and of course it passed by one vote, and that senator was Frank LaRose. He's a freshman out of the Akron area. So I'm not certain, and this is part of the problem with the legislative process, what happens in those caucuses sometimes is really muddy and it's like making sausage. So who the actual senators were that were driving that debate behind closed doors, I can't tell you for sure. I can tell you that one of the votes they were trying to save was LaRose, and I think that's where some of the weakening of the bill came from, was to try to ensure, and there were probably other senators. I know Gilmore was questionable until the last minute. So there were 3 or 4 senators that were kind of holding out that I think they felt like they needed to weaken the bill for in order to make sure that they had the votes to get it out of the Senate.
yeah, because what I think is what these groups are great for is if you can get us the names, we can make sure people are aware of that. And I think that's what we need to do is start shining the spotlight on these politicians that are fence sitters and aren't taking a principled approach. We already know about Jim Hughes. And you know, as soon as that happens, those emails are flying, and if we can put a name to it, we can make sure that those politicians understand we're watching them.
I think Hughes, Gilmore, LaRose.
Yeah, it was Sykes, Grindell, Hughes, Gilmore, and LaRose were the 5. And as a matter of fact, I'm glad you asked that question, because if you guys will go to it on, I think it's on the back of here, AmericansProsperity.org. You need to go to Ohio or AmericansProsperity.org. If you sign up, you will get my emails. And on Monday, I sent out an action alert saying these are the 5 that we need to contact. And if you click here, it'll take you to a page where you can send one email and it'll automatically go to all 5. And actually, within less than 24 hours, we got 2,300 emails to those 5 senators. We got even more after that, but I checked like right before the 24-hour mark. And so, and I have posted, if you go to the Ohio page, I've also posted all of the senators that voted for the bill and all the senators that voted against the bill. And you're going to start seeing some of them, and that's an excellent point, lining up one way or the other. For example, I know that Bill Seitz, who was one of the people who was against this bill, Senate Bill 5, is also against the next bill I'm going to talk about, which is House Bill 3, which is to end the death tax. So you're exactly right. We need to keep a watch on those, and we need to specifically, I was trying to be nice at the beginning of the process and just telling people to call their own senators, but by the end I'm like, forget it, let's just call the ones that we know are issues, and that's probably the way we'll do it from now on, because I believe that the way this is going to happen is I think that Governor Kasich is probably going to propose a really good budget, and I think that the House is probably going to go along. I think we're going to have some challenges in the Senate. I mean, if you consider the fact that we have well, I shouldn't say we, because America's Prosperity is not partisan, but conservatives, if you're going to assume that Republicans are supposed to be conservative, there are 23 Republicans in the Senate and 10 Democrats. Yet it was, I mean, this bill squeaked by 17-16, and that does not bode well for what's going to happen over the next few months. So we're going to have a lot of hard work to do. And we're going to talk some in the grassroots training portion, about how it's hard to keep up with the unions. You know, they essentially pay people to go because they get paid days off. So we're going to have to be creative in how we handle that. I'm going to move on now to House Bill 3, which is to end the estate tax. And it is in the House right now. They took testimony on it, and it's out of committee. It's waiting to be voted on the floor. My understanding is they're going to wait to vote on it until after the governor comes out with his budget. It should pass the House fairly easily. When it goes to the Senate, it's going to have some opposition. Specifically, one of the things they're talking about doing is allowing allowing local jurisdictions to opt in and out. Right now, the way that the law works is that 80% of the proceeds of the estate tax go back to the township or municipality where the person died. Which means that in the wealthy districts where wealthy people live, the money comes back to that area. So those areas that get that money were at those hearings testifying about how they really need that money. However, what I would like to point out is that only a very small percentage of jurisdictions, of municipalities and townships get that. If you look, and I think it was 2008, at all the townships that received estate tax revenue, just 4% of all of the townships received 60% of the revenue. So it is extremely skewed towards the wealthy jurisdictions. You know, and if the jurisdictions that are not wealthy can make do without it, then the wealthy jurisdictions can make do without it. I mean, I recognize that they have built it in to their budgets. I mean, they shouldn't, because it's not something that's reliable. It's not a reliable source that you should build into your operating budget, but they have. But now the bill has been amended, so it doesn't start until estates for people dying on or after January 1, 2013. So these jurisdictions will have some time to adjust. And so you may see proposals to allow certain jurisdictions to opt in or out, but don't be fooled by that. It's not a fix, because obviously any jurisdiction that actually gets the money now is going to opt to stay in the system, and so it's not going to be any different. What we need is a certain date by which the death tax just goes away in Ohio, because what it's doing is it's driving jobs out of Ohio, because it's wealthy people don't want to die in a state where they have to pay an estate tax. And people, it discourages investment. It discourages, I mean, even home ownership here in Ohio, because our death tax hits at such a low level. It's the lowest level. Well, we're one of only 20 states that even bothers to have an estate tax. And it's arguably the worst, because it hits at about $333,000, which means, and Seth pointed out during our last one, I think you said that life insurance proceeds are counted in that. So it's not as difficult as you would think to get up to $333,000 if you have life insurance, or if you have a house. It hits a lot of family farms, hits small businesses, so it discourages investment in Ohio. So it's, and if you look at, economists will tell you that because it does that, because it drives people out of Ohio, it actually is a net loss in tax revenue. Because if those people who left Ohio lived here, we'd get their income tax, and we'd get their sales tax, and we'd get their property tax, but because they left, we didn't get any of it. So that is sort of on hold right now in the House, but I have here on this red sheet on the front page just gives some action items to call your state reps about, and give some talking points on each of them. And so it would be helpful to call your state representative at this point and tell them to go ahead and vote for the estate tax, because, you know, even though it should pass the House easily, doesn't mean it necessarily will. So please do that. When it gets to the Senate, you'll be seeing action alerts, I'm sure, because it will be more difficult to get it through there. The last one I'm going to talk about before I turn it over to Seth is HJR 2, which is a joint resolution, and it is essentially, the language of it is pretty much the same as the petitions that the Ohio Project has been circulating. And what it would do is, if the resolution passes, it will put on the ballot an amendment to the Constitution that people will have the opportunity to vote on. And essentially what it'll do is it'll say that government cannot force you to purchase health insurance. So the goal is to some extent, nullify Obamacare here in Ohio. However, even with that, we still have the problem of, in 2014, when the Medicaid levels are kicked up, that's going to hit our budget here in Ohio too, because even though the federal government has said, okay, we'll cover the extra Medicaid for 3 years, well, after 3 years, the amount that Ohio has to cover significantly increases each year, and also they don't cover the administrative costs. So Ohio's going to have tons of administrative costs. So even if we balance our budget this time, we're going to have this issue starting 2014 or even before if we start planning for the administrative costs. And so one of the benefits of passing this amendment to the Constitution is it helps with constitutional arguments at the federal level to try to get Obamacare nullified in the Supreme Court. So even though it doesn't do it automatically, it helps. So please call your state representative and ask them to support HJR 2, because we need 3/5 majority to get this passed, so we need every Republican in the House to vote for it. We also need 1 Democrat to vote for it. So I'm going to turn it over to Seth.
I always have to editorialize a little bit. I just want to say real briefly that I think sometimes we conservatives have a hard time because we get caught in this trap of rhetorical arguments. The fact is, healthcare reform, quote unquote, is going to cost an awful lot of money, right? But we're opposed to it, really, because it's an infringement on liberty and it's unconstitutional, correct? Let's talk about Senate Bill 5. The fact is, I don't think any of us in this room, at least I'm not opposed to the right to collectively bargain. What I'm opposed to is stopping employees from having to work through a union in order to get a job, especially at the public level. Rebecca made that point. It's easy to get caught in the trap as you start to argue about these things, which you do, about what people are worth. How do you put a value on a police officer who's going up to a dark car with guys that have guns in it? You can't put a value on that. How do you put a value on a teacher who has your child? You can't put a value on that. For that matter, how do you put a value on a young 18-year-old who's charging a hill in Afghanistan? You can't put a value on that. But the market puts a value on that every day. And in a free market environment, in a capitalistic environment, which we believe in because it creates wealth, the market defines that. A willing buyer and a willing seller in a free market defines the value, right? So long as we have people who are willing to work as police officers, so long as we have people who are willing to work as teachers, that's the market rate. And what we're in favor of is allowing the market rate to survive. So it's very hard to get in an argument with somebody about what an officer is worth. You really can't win that argument. But what you can win the argument of is the capitalistic system that provides for value. It's really the same thing with the estate tax. We can argue all day long about what the right threshold is. It's horrific in Ohio, and we need to do everything we can to kill it. And we need to take those practical steps and those unpractical steps, but the reality is, why in the world do you have to be taxed for dying at the federal or state level makes no sense at all. Let's talk about some less exciting stuff, but frankly, these are extremely important discussions that need to be had because they're going to come into John Kasich's budget, and they're areas where the state of Ohio spends a tremendous amount of money. Corrections is the first one we're going to talk about. And these are kind of complicated areas of policy. I'm going to be brief. When we do Q&A, I'll be happy to try to expand on any questions, but I have a tendency to go long as it is, so I'm going to try to keep this short. Basically, in Ohio, we have a very quickly rising rate of inmates, and they're costing on average, I've got up there about 21K was in 04 on average per year. We think that number is closer to about $29,000 to $30,000 now. And when you're talking about having as many inmates as we have, you're talking about roughly close to $2 billion, $1.6 billion in spending. That's your tax dollars that you're spending to keep people incarcerated. Now, obviously, we want the worst of the society incarcerated, but a lot of this has frankly come from what others in the past maybe would consider to be conservative, quote unquote, legislators who want to be strong in the area of crime. And so they go out and they pass legislation or propose legislation that makes mandatory sentencing, for instance, for the first-time drug abuser. And so what you end up with is judges who are not so much making decisions based on the merits of the case, but judges that are really just pushing paper because the legislature has come through and said, you must do X, Y, and Z with this type of offender. So a lot of the focus these days, Bill Seitz has taken some hits today already because he doesn't support the estate tax repeal and he didn't support SB 5, but this is one of the areas that he's very good on. He's made some strong proposals around the area of corrections reform. There are others in the legislature who are looking at it. This will be dicey when it comes up because some of those legislators will take a hit back in their districts for being quote unquote weak on crime. This is the type of stuff that's really easy to put on a postcard and beat somebody up over in a campaign. But unless we deal with the ever-increasing number of inmates, this is going to continue to be a problem area in our budget. Now, it's not as big as some of the other areas we're going to talk about, but at $1.6 billion, it's a huge issue. If we continue to see the rate of inmates expand as it has been, you're going to be building prisons out the union, okay? And you're going to continue to see that cost increase. So what we're suggesting is that this is an area that you folks have your eye on. Senator Seitz is going to be reintroducing the bill in regards to correction reform. I think that bill could be stronger and go further. You're going to hear that theme a lot, but it is a good start. And when you start to hear this rhetoric come out, it'll probably end up being a discussion through the budget as well. We think you need to be informed on this because it's an area that you could save tremendous amounts of money. Now, we're not talking about letting rapists loose, okay? What we are talking about is allowing judges to do the judge part and allowing for some of these less offenders that maybe need to be under house arrest or in a community service or probation period, allowing the judges to have the flexibility to make those changes so that our prison population doesn't continue to exponentially increase. The public pension area is also rather boring when it comes to policy, but it's a huge area that's going to cost us a lot of money unless we get our arms around it. All 5 of the public pension systems in Ohio are broke. Okay? They're broke if you look at it from the standpoint of what their liabilities are compared to their assets. Okay? In the private world, which I work in a lot, we wouldn't let anybody get away with this. Okay? They have billions upon billions upon billions of dollars that are unfunded as it relates to their the expected amount of money that they must provide in benefits. Just a little technical background, okay? These pension systems are actually separate. This isn't like Social Security. The legislature has no right, and to my knowledge never has, and if they did when I was there, you would have heard it from the rooftops from me. These are not rated. This isn't a result of the fact that the legislature is going in there and rating these funds. These are true trust accounts, okay? The problem is that the benefits of state employees, the benefits of local employees, in every single one of those categories, those 5 pension systems have been traditionally so high, and now that the market has depleted, those benefits haven't come back in line. And because they are dealing with what's called a defined benefit plan, which has gone out of vogue many, many decades ago in the private market, and I'll explain that in a minute, that benefit, that expected benefit continues to be the same, if not growing, because of the cost of the inflation, while the market is going down or did go down, as well as the amount of money that's available from you, the taxpayers, to fund through those salaries, those pension benefits, okay? If that makes sense. The problem with this and why it's on our list is, unless the reforms are substantial enough to deal with and get these benefits in order, wind up with where they're actually at in assets, we think this is going to be an area where they're going to come back to taxpayers to fund it. Because how else can they do it? Okay, the money has to come from someplace. All the money that they have, all the money that's in all those systems has either come from you or it's interest and dividends that have come from money that you gave them to invest. A defined benefit program, just briefly, it's exactly as it sounds. It defines the benefit you would receive inside a pension, all right? Some of you may have defined benefit programs. There's nothing wrong inherently with the defined benefit program. The problem is that they can be very expensive. Because if I promise you that you're going to make X amount of money for the rest of your life once you retire, it's kind of hard for me to manage that 20 years before you retire, right? Especially in a changing market. So in the private world, by and large, defined benefit programs are out the window. That's frankly what helped get GM in all the trouble they got into financially, because they had defined benefit programs. They couldn't fund those defined benefit programs, and eventually they just went into bankruptcy to clear their books. In most cases, we're in what's called a defined contribution plan. That's what most people's 401ks are and IRAs are. Defined contribution is just as it sounds. It defines the contribution that's going in day one, and then it allows the market to do what it needs to do, rather than defining the benefit on the back end. You were going to ask a question.
Well, I was just wondering what, if there were any proposals to get these folks on a defined contribution plan like everyone else, or and what are the chances of that happening?
I'll answer that in 1 second, sir. You had
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, the most important thing about a defined contribution plan, it is impossible to underfund a defined contribution plan.
Right.
That's what everybody has in the private sector, and I'd like to propose a solution on how you'd make sure that everyone wanted to get into a defined contribution plan. The moment you start threatening to force all these public workers to pay, you're going to roll this into Social Security, they'll come around real quick.
Amen. Yeah, many of you may not know this. A public employee, at least in the state of Ohio, I'm not certain I can speak across the nation. Myself, I mean, I'm part of the PERS system because I served in the State House and as a city council member for 7 years. That money that I earned wasn't taxed Social Security because the federal government gives a waiver to the states to stay out of that, so long as that they have an equivalent or better retirement system. There will be a reform bill coming down the pike. I can't remember, to be honest with you, whether it's already been introduced. I've heard some rumors about it. Has Watchman introduced that? Do you know?
Yeah, it's in, and it's having several hearings.
Okay.
And right now there is not a proposal to switch
No.
to defined. contribution.
Right now, all they're talking about changing is the way you get to the benefit portion, okay? So right now, it depends on the system you look at. All 5 of these systems have different policies. You can't throw one stat and say that applies to all 5. But generally speaking, for instance, in the system I'm in, my top 3 years of service is what they use as the baseline to calculate my pension, okay? So there's a proposal that says, no, it's not going to be top 3, it's going to be top 5. Okay, well, that's going to change it a little bit. To your point, probably not enough. So they're talking about that. They're talking about increasing the retirement age. They're talking about dealing with health care expectations inside those pension funds because the health care is paid for by some of these pension funds. Again, the real problem is if they don't get this under control, the highest rate that the employer, which in this case would either be a city or a state government or school government, pays is 19% on behalf of the employee into the pension fund. Again, every bit of that money is coming from you, the taxpayers. So again, this is an area that reform is coming. There's something called the Ohio Retirement Study Council that goes through all these machinations, and then they make recommendations to the state legislature that has the ultimate authority and responsibility to reform these plans. The ORCL or Ohio Retirement ORSCL is not going, frankly, to recommend major changes to itself. So it's going to take some real courage from the legislative leadership to get that done. I can tell you Watchman would be one of the guys who I think would support a defined contribution plan. I think they're trying to pick at this to see how much support they can get before they move further. I would expect, I don't know for sure, but I would expect that you will see bills recommending defined contribution plans, but I'll be blunt with you, I don't know that there's the political will right now to actually go that far. There should be.
Maybe at least new employees.
Maybe new employees, right. She had her hand up, I'm sorry, sir, but I will come back.
I'm part of the SERS, the school employees, and you know, I read every like month or so you get a little newsletter.
Yep.
And there's things in there where it says that they are required by state law to have funded like 20 years
Right.
plus. I mean, is that? And I always looked at that and thought, well, okay, then it's a sound system. We're okay.
They're all.
But
there's the retirement plans are always going to feed rhetoric to their active members. I don't remember the law off the top of my head to tell you whether or not it's 20. I'm sure they're not lying.
yeah, it's a significant number.
Part of the problem is the way they measure the expected future liability. So they'll make, for instance, estimates that their market is going to grow, their assets and their pool are going to grow by 8% a year. Okay, that's the actuarial expectation they'll use. Well, how many of you got an 8% return on your investments, over the last 5 years? And so maybe that was true, in the late 90s or the early 2000s, but it's not true today. So it depends on how they're actuarially looking at their pool of assets. So long as they're allowed to get away with that, I can make a statement all day long that we're going to be funded for 20 years. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Rebecca, were you going to add something, or was that what you were
That's
going to say?
exactly what I was
Okay. Sir, you had your hand up. I'll come to you.
Yeah, I just heard an FOP guy speaking on the radio this morning saying that these pension things were offered to them in lieu of other benefits or pay raises. And he's saying, well, you can't take away this. Now, after we've already agreed to...
Well, this is an area where some may accuse that, and I'm going to speak for myself, but some may say that, Seth, you're not being very conservative. This is like Social Security as far as I'm concerned. I'd be happy at my age for the federal government to lock me out of the system and say you're on your own and you can keep your money. But I wouldn't do that to my grandmother who's 90 years old. I don't know what that police officer situation is, but the fact is there's a lot of people in the system that are now retired or of retirement age, and I'm not certain we should be stripping away what they worked for, whether it was over market or under market, because that's what they worked for. But that doesn't mean that we can't come back and do defined contribution, draw a line in the sand, say we're not doing that anymore, change the system for those, like myself, who maybe have 9-10 years in the system. I don't necessarily feel like I deserve that. And I would go back. I don't know what that police officer was making, and again, firefighters and police officers I always counted as some of my best friends politically. They never really supported me because I was a conservative and I didn't, kowtow to their unions. But that's one of the most basic services we can provide as taxpayers. I believe in that service. To me, it's like the national defense of our country, okay? But that said, I have no idea what that guy was making, but I can tell you when I was a city council member at Huber Heights, those guys weren't doing too badly, plus their retirement, okay? So I'm not certain how sympathetic I'd be. I'm sorry, go ahead, or you, I don't care.
I got a couple of issues with this whole pension system. I'm not going to argue that it's a mess right now.
Right.
And I'm not going to argue that it doesn't need to change. But I've spent a lot of time looking at this, particularly from the school level, as I've got more involved with school district finances. And the first question I got for you is, who oversees these? Because there's your problem.
Yep.
Because the reality is, if anybody has ever gone through an actuarial analysis of their own retirement plan, the school district employees contribute 10% of their pay in, and the school district contributes another 14%. And I'm not saying we should be contributing that 14%, but we are, which is 24%. And if anybody's done their own retirement analysis, if you put 24% of your salary away every single year, that's a lot of money at the end of a 30-year career. Which is why when we criticize these people retiring on 80% of their salary, whatever it is, it's a little unfair because that's a lot of money that's being put in. And I know that they don't, the way they invest these things is kind of conservative. It's not as conservative as they claim it is, as can be seen by the losses. And I know one of these with the whole coins issue, they lost a lot of money. But the biggest problem with the STRS is the 13th paycheck they gave out. When things were good, they gave everybody a 13th, the retirees a 13th paycheck. And so, to me, from a pure numbers perspective, even with the downturn in the stock market in the last couple of years, STRS should not be in the state it's in today.
I didn't bring my summary. If you go to the Ohio Retirement Study Council, there's a website. If you Google that, I'm not going to remember it off the top of my head, you'll find their underfunded liability just in a pamphlet that the Ohio Retirement Study Council itself has produced. So there's no rhetoric in that number, okay? It's woefully underfunded.
It is, but it shouldn't be.
Well, right, there's a
what's
board.
going into that
Every
system.
single one of these have a board, okay? And by state law, it's defined as to who's going to be sitting on that board, not by name. But there will be 2 representations of labor, there will be 2 representations of management, there's a couple members of the legislature, that type of thing. And those boards technically kind of report up to this Ohio Retirement Study Council, which then has the job to make a recommendation to the legislature, which technically oversees the whole thing.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, as far as rotating over and defined contribution plan, all these plans, they have assets backing them. They are underfunded, but they have assets backing them. So if there's going to be a legislator going, you can make the argument that what we're going to do is we're going to pay out a lump sum into a target retirement fund, and then maybe issue bonds to cover up that shortfall, mainly towards the people way far from retirement. There's a lot of easy ways to do this. But the other way I would go about this is the fraud, the outright fraud, because what they do is they game the system with those last 3 years by going with overtime. If you take a look at the highest paid worker in Madison, Wisconsin, was a bus driver. Why? Because the union rigs it so that that person could work so many years of overtime. He doubled his salary those last 3 years, and he retires on that. So if you start threatening them with an investigation into the fraud that goes on, and start showing them, and then start comparing their benefits versus Social Security to show the inequality going on, I think you might have a good place, but I would really be fighting for that defined contribution because that's the only way you save the industrial base. And if those things are left alone, they're death sentences for anyone that runs them. Matter of fact, I know because I run them.
That's for all of us. We should all be fighting for this defined contribution plan. The last question, if you all don't mind, we can come back to this in the Q&A, but got a couple other, no, go ahead, ma'am.
No, it's my understanding, I'm in STRS too, and you can't, they've got guidelines that you can't game the system. There's only so much you can do for teaching a summer or something like that. They do have some.
Again, I said.
Maybe not enough, but they do have some.
Well, and I've never dealt with STRS except as a legislator. PERS was what Andy, police and fire, I had quite a bit of experience with that because of my time in the city. And we'd have cops and firefighters. That was a regular discussion behind closed doors where somebody would want to, cash in. The debate over whether or not their vacation that got cashed in was part of the retirement system or not. And so it does happen, sir, you're right. I'm sure there's always good policies that are well-meaning, but often they're found, there's ways around. This is the Medicaid. The largest portion of the GRF goes to Medicaid. This is a constantly growing part of our budget. Governor Kasich was just talking about this yesterday on a conference call I was on with NFIB. He's got some cool ideas for Medicaid. The biggest thing that we can do on the Medicaid side is continue, frankly, in my opinion, to push on states' rights. And let me tell you why. As you see on the slide there, for every dollar we spend in Medicaid, it's matched by $1.75 of federal funding from the federal government. Now, that might sound good in kind of a pragmatic way, and most of the legislators, even the conservative ones up there, they don't want to mess with that ratio because, of course, that $1.75 is funding much of the Medicaid services that are going throughout Ohio. And I don't think any of us disagree that the poor need supported. You know, the true poor, those most needy in our society, I certainly wouldn't be, you know, opposed to making sure that they've got funding through Medicaid. But when you've got legislators who, if they have 4 kids and that's their only income, they would qualify for something called S-CHIPS, which is the Children's Medicaid program. I think that benefit level is a little ridiculous. When you've got where seniors want to live at home and be cared for at home, rather than going to a nursing retirement community, which is the most expensive form of care for a senior, and most seniors don't even want to be in a nursing home, but they're forced into a nursing home by Medicaid because there's not a voucher that allows them to stay in their own home. I think that's a problem. We've all heard the stories about the abuse of the Medicaid throughout, both by individuals gaming the system, as well as some of these private companies that are part of the administration. That doesn't mean you throw the individuals and the private companies out, but there's a lot of opportunity around the abuse. Every time, though, that anybody talks about Medicaid policy, the first thing that comes up from those in the system who want to keep it the same is the federal match. There's a standard of care that the federal government requires you to keep in order to maintain the federal dollars flowing through. This is the old carrots approach, carrot and stick, bait and switch, whatever you want to call it, that the federal government plays largely in the area of Medicaid and in education, where they're constantly keeping the states at bay. John Kasich has already gone to the president and said, hey, I need you to loosen up these standards, and you can imagine what President Obama said to John Kasich. He didn't invite him to the garden for a beer.
Probably stupidly.
Yeah, so anyway, this is an area that we're gonna have to push on as well. Very complicated area, and I'm not trying to, it's complicated for me. I mean, this is just a complicated area for whoever you talk to. But there's a lot of things we could do, both little things pragmatically inside, which I think you're gonna see coming out of the budget, as well as big ideas, like vouchers for these seniors to frankly go where they wanna go, instead of being forced into a nursing retirement center. Almost all of these areas, there, by the way, is a lobby that is behind the scenes that's making money off these policies. The nursing care centers, many of them are my friends, but they're one of the few industries that actually have their reimbursement rates written in code inside the Ohio Revised Code. Most reimbursement rates, most contracts like that are done administratively with the agency, not the nursing homes. They actually have it in the law. It's part, I mean, you can look it up in the Ohio Revised Code. Their lobby is huge, very, very strong. And so getting a voucher program in place for seniors, which would benefit the seniors and the state, becomes kind of strangely very hard when the nursing home lobby goes into effect. Now, that doesn't make these folks bad people necessarily, but this is part of that shared sacrifice. I wouldn't call it shared sacrifice. It's part of liberty coming back to life. And so those of the best lobby that you folks need to become that lobby, that liberty lobby that says enough's enough here. Medicaid's one of those areas that if we don't get our arms around it, we're in deep doo-doo. Education is another very complicated area. It's probably the area of all of these that's closest to my heart. There's a lot of activity that I think will come in the education area in the next couple of years. Governor Strickland's education reform proposals were a total bust. They were an absolute mess. It took what was already one of the best funded systems in the country and immediately made it underfunded by $2 billion more. So let's put that in perspective. We're facing right now an $8 billion budget deficit. Education is the second largest group of money that we spend in the GRF next to Medicaid, roughly $6.5 billion as you see there. and he underfunded it now by another 2. That doesn't mean he cut it by 2. He said what is already one of the best funded in the country needs to be funded by $2 billion more. To be honest with you, it was a payoff to the unions. He would obviously argue with me that it wasn't, but it was. A lot of fight. I was heavily involved in that fight, and we're now going to see this go the other way. Instead of becoming more focused on units, as he called them, and how many students need to be per teacher and all that stuff, there's already a bill introduced that, again, in my mind, doesn't go far enough, but it's a fantastic start. That's House Bill 136. You might write that down. It was introduced by a gentleman named Matt Huffman from Lima. He's a fantastic guy. Would dramatically expand vouchers throughout the state of Ohio. If you can put downward pressure on cost and upward pressure on quality, you're going to see a big change in the education community across the board. Right now, there is little to no downward pressure on cost. There is some upward pressure on quality coming both out of the federal government and, frankly, the state standards. But there's zero downward pressure on the cost. House Bill 136 takes an idea that many people have had, but one that I'm a huge believer in, actually puts in place something called an educational savings account. So if you were to get one of these vouchers and spend less than that voucher, you'd actually be able to spend money off individually into an educational savings account for your child. Now, how much sense does that make? And if you start thinking about the market ramifications to that, if I'm able to put money away, and now I'm able as a parent to gain from that, my child gained through that, and I don't have to worry about as much college savings, then what do you think I'm going to do? I'm going to look for the lowest cost, highest quality education for my child, thereby giving myself a true market approach to this, right? This is an area I have at the end that it can be done, because I can't tell you how many people I've heard say, oh, it's too complicated. This is it's another very messy area of public policy. It has to do with the local match and the state money and the money that comes down from the feds and yada, 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 yada. They go on and on and on, but the money's there. If we wanted to move to a voucher program for all, the money's there. It can be done, and it needs to be done, because that downward pressure on cost. I mean, this is another area where, I mean, I don't know how many times I heard Republicans get up and talk about, or conservatives, get up and talk about how dare the governor cut education. Well, I don't want to cut my kids' education either, but we're spending an awful lot of money, and the result is not necessarily there. So reforms like this, I think you're going to see in the governor's budget. You already see them in House Bill 136, which I think, frankly, they're planning to roll some of that into the budget. This and Medicaid, all these areas are going to be hugely important to the fiscal soundness of our state. But this and Medicaid in particular are going to drive the largest portion of that. So it's something we need to be aware of.
May I put some numbers to what you're just talking about there? Right now in Columbus, we're spending $11,000 per student. You can send your child to Watterson for $5,000. That means we could send 2 children for Watterson for what we're spending to send 1 child to Columbus Public Schools, which is a failed system. But under the model he just proposed, you would spend $5,000 to go to Watterson, $5,000 would go into a college savings account for your child. So not only would you improve education, cut costs, you'd also be paying for your child's college education. That's a heck of a lot better than the current system we have right now. It's literally just pouring money down a rat.
One of the biggest problems with what he just said, and I completely agree with you, sir. I mean, we've got a school in Dayton where I'm from called Miami Valley Schools. Their placement rate in colleges is 100%, at least it was a couple years ago. These kids are coming out, many of them going to Harvard and Yale. I mean, it's one of the premier private schools, and I'm sure every big community has them, but that's Dayton's. Secular, it's not religious. I'm very religious, that's not a shot at it, but it's not like they're just really hammering on educational quality. But part of the problem with what you just said and where the debate comes, and I want to say this to you folks because just like the SB 5 issue, the union issue, I think our job is trying to help arm you. We don't have all the answers. To engage in these debates. What you're going to hear, that $11,000 number is generally pretty accurate, but a major portion of that, depending on what school district you're in, is coming from the local base. So the state's actually not taking $11,000 worth. They're funding a portion that makes up the $11,000 when you add the local levy to it. Now, from a taxpayer's perspective, we look at that and say, it's all the same pool, right? It's our money, we paid for it, however it happens. But this is where the muddiness comes when they start talking about trying to reform the education system. And that's why when I said all I heard while I was up there is it can't be done, and it's hard, and we got this problem and that problem. The money's there. There's tools, there's ways we can get around this. Some have proposed a statewide sales tax or a statewide property tax. I know many of you, I just saw the eyes roll. That immediately sounds repulsive to us as conservatives. This is a different, probably a conversation that could take another 3 hours at least on its own. But I would propose to you, I don't think that's where the governor's necessarily going, and I don't think you have to go there. I did a lot of work on this issue when I was in the House and actually introduced a bill right before I left, but I was in the minority and nobody cared what I did. I think you can get there without doing some of those statewide things, but if you hear those proposals, please, I beg you, don't immediately dismiss it. What they might be trying to do is grab a hold of that local match to get it to fund something like a voucher program statewide, okay? At the end of the day, you want to pay less taxes, have downward pressure on cost and upward pressure on quality. That's the goal we have from a taxpayer standpoint. We really don't care if it's the Franklin County Treasurer collecting it or the state of Ohio, so long as there's accountability and it's less cost to us, right?
There's no accountability right now.
There's no accountability right
No,
now, and you've
zero.
got all these school districts all doing their thing, but it is kind of a complicated area of law, but this is the right direction. We are going way over time, but you folks are so engaged.
We're going to do
we've got
grassroots. Real quick.
yeah.
I'm going to say one thing really quickly before we do grassroots, which is on the public pensions. Americans for Prosperity's position with respect to defined contribution is that we wouldn't want to change anything for people who are already in the system and who've been promised something, but for new employees, we're going to be urging the state legislature to move to a defined contribution plan as opposed to a defined benefit plan. So that's where we'll be. And I'm sure the groups will be all over the different, all over the board on that. But we're all fighting for basically the same thing, so we can all work together. How many of you guys came out to the rally on the 17th? All right, thank you for coming out. And I'm so happy that I am in Columbus, the Columbus area tonight, because we're going to need help from all of you guys over the next few months, because it is difficult, and I know this, it is difficult to get off in the middle of the day and to go downtown. And starting probably a couple months ago when Seth and I started talking about doing this, he said, oh, you're going to be needing to support the legislators, and there's going to be all these special interests that come out, and I was sort of like, yeah, I believe you, yeah. But I didn't actually believe him. I mean, I believed him, but I didn't understand the magnitude until Senate Bill 5 happened. And
Have you been talking to my wife? Because she never believes me either until it happens.
he kept saying I'm thinking, the special interests, they can't have as many people as we do. But whoa, was I wrong? And because I didn't recognize that they were going to have people who would come in from out of state. I was taking pictures of buses, union buses, and I saw one from West Virginia, two from Michigan. The unions have tons of money. I encourage you to go to the Buckeye Institute's website. They recently did a study about unions and how much money they're spending. They spent $500 billion in the last election on political things, not just in Ohio, but across the country. And that's a lot of where the union dues go. And so what you're seeing is you pay taxpayer dollars to the state. I'm sorry, I'm still on policy, but I'm going to get to groceries. You pay taxpayer dollars to the state. That money goes to pay the state employees. The union dues come out of that money. And so it's your tax dollars that's paying the union dues that then pay for their rallies against what we want.
Exactly.
So it's kind of ironic. So, the day that we had the rally was awesome. We had about 800 people there. We had buses come in from all over the state, and that was great. But I got to tell you, the next Tuesday I was there, and I felt like I was the only person from our side there. There were about 5,000 people from their side, and we had not tried to get people there that day. What Americans for Prosperity did that day was we did what we called patch-through calls to 6 targeted state senators. And I was all excited because I knew we couldn't get people there, but I thought, okay, at least we're going to have these calls, because we were calling in each of the 6 districts, 15,000 households, telling them about Senate Bill 5 and saying, if you want to talk to your senator right now, press 1. It would connect them. And I was all excited until I got there, and the senators already had, 1,000 phone calls from the other side. And so I got to say, that was the most depressing day since I started doing this. I thought, how are we ever going to compete? However, then we'll leave you the depressing thought, because then I talked to some senators, and they recognize that the unions have a structural advantage. They recognize that the unions have our tax dollars to fund this, and they recognize that the union members can get paid days off to go. I mean, it looked like school was out when I was there. And they recognize that, there are some union headquarters right downtown Columbus, so they don't have very far to go. Whereas on our side, you actually have to have some notice, which we weren't getting. you know, the hearing on Tuesday was announced at 7 o'clock Friday night. So how many people can get off with that little notice? Not many. So they recognize that we have a structural disadvantage. However, we do still need to be a voice. We need to be a voice in their offices, and we need to be a voice in the press. And we're going to have to come up with more creative ways to do that. We're going to have to start, you know, possibly having our rallies, even if they're not as big, maybe at, you know, a news station or maybe at a union headquarters. We'll still have some downtown, but we do, when we say please make phone calls and emails, and I know tons of you do, we don't have to keep up with their numbers, but we do have to have a presence. And since you guys are in Columbus and you're close, I'm going to ask you to please, please, if you can. I mean, I know you can't always, but if you can, please come down because you're here, you know. So you're going to be the troops. So Seth is going to talk to you more specifically about things that actually work to do when you call or email a legislator. This is a booklet that I am not going to go through word for word. It's something that I would ask you to use as a reference to take home with you. And it has good tips on if you want to testify, things you should do. If you want to write a letter, things you should do. And it gives some examples of letters. If you want to call your state representative, talks about you can have a house party at your house and educate friends and families and neighbors, which is, we need to be doing that because these are complicated issues and a lot of people don't understand them. And the unions have more money to get their word out about and to get their propaganda out, frankly, about their side of this. But, you know, their side, gee, this is an attack on the middle class, is not true. But people, if they hear that, may not believe it. So you need to be talking to people all the time and explaining why that's not true. It also goes through, you know, if you want to start a blog, it tells you technically how to do that. If you want to do Facebook, it tells you how to do that. If you want to do Twitter, it tells you how to do that. So I would encourage you to thumb through here, see what all the topics are, and then if you decide you want to do these things, use it as a manual, you know, just look at it before. I'm sorry, do you have a question?
Well, I don't want to interrupt you, but
Yeah.
I want to tell you something. We've already got the most powerful weapon in Columbus, Ohio, and 3 of them are right here, and that's talk radio, because we're going to kick their booty on the air with the media, and Tomato George is over there, West Side Bob, and myself, the ringleader, and we already make more of a
Who's
difference.
Tomato George? Because I've heard of Tomato George. Raise your hand.
Yeah.
George.
That's you, buddy.
To me until right now.
Yeah, Tomato
So no,
George.
I absolutely agree with you that is definitely one of the things we need to be doing. We need to be in charge of the public debate, and talk radio is one of the best ways to do that.
Well, and we've already done it, and we're going to continue to do it.
So we can get through this because people may want to get going because it's getting late. I'm gonna call.
Can I just add? No, I'm not going to add to him, but one of the things that I think the conservative movement misses is the comment areas on news sites. And if you paid any attention during the 2008 election, the Democrats and OFA and whoever else, they had a very simple process. If you tried to debate, they shouted you down, and they spammed these places with so many comments that your comment just got lost.
Okay,
And
I want to discuss all this with you because what we need ideas, we need creative ideas for things to do. I want to let Seth finish up our training right now because he's going to talk about some effective ways to contact your legislator and what works and what doesn't work, and then we'll have some question and answer session after, so anyone who wants to get going can get going. But I want to hear all the ideas everyone has. I'm open for ideas.
Perception is what?
Reality.
It's reality. And in the area of how do you get your legislator to respond, unfortunately, perception is reality. And I would tell you that in my experience, and I've never gone through and like listed each legislator, but both in the city level and at the state level, I've never served at the federal level, I would say probably 15 to 20 max % of the individuals that you have in elected positions. And then, you know, your city might be different, okay? But I'm just talking macro level, are really driven by absolute principle, okay? Where they believe deeply in something and they ran on that promise and they went there and they did it. Part of my challenge with the conservative movement right now, it always frustrates me. I like liberals who are principled. Now, I don't like their policies. I think their policies stink. But I'd much rather deal with a liberal principle, or a principled liberal, than a mushy, quote-unquote, conservative who is conservative only because his or her district is, or is conservative because their leadership is, or is conservative because the money they got was conservative, okay? So you've got to understand that when you start to think about how you address your legislator. This changes your approach, and it always will. If you're dealing with someone very principled, you're probably able to have conversations that are more policy related. What this does directly to XYZ constituency, or you as a constituent, et cetera. When you're dealing with folks that aren't as principled, frankly, it becomes a little easier and difficult at the same time. So let me just reiterate that perception, I'm going to deal with the perception is reality, and that really applies to the other 80 to 85%, as I've marked it, just generally speaking in my mind, of individuals who are legislating, who are really legislating from a position normally of trying to make sure that they maintain their power, okay? That 15 to 20%, if that's really the number of individuals that are really principled, those are the folks you're going to be able to call up on the phone. You're going to have a really deep debate. They might really frustrate you sometimes because it may look like they're not listening. And other times you may be really proud of them because it looks like they made a stand that you agree with. But they believe in something and they're out there doing it. By and large, though, you're dealing with the other set. Because by and large, the majority is not all that principled when it comes down to it. So, how do you change those folks' minds? Well, I'm just going to be direct. I know cameras are running, but that's the way it goes. Perception's reality, and there's a lot of money in politics, and my guess is none of you are writing $10,000 checks to legislators. Now, I'm not suggesting that they're for sale, because I think most of them are better than that, and I mean that. I knew a lot of these folks. I think most of them are better than that, okay? But that does create a round of influence. And so one of my big frustrations with the GOP is the GOP, especially in the late 2000s and 10, this last decade, really became the country club party. It became the party of corporate welfare in many respects. And many times the big business agenda really did way more than the liberty agenda did, okay? Now, we can debate that, we can argue about it. Would I rather have some of the big business policies than social left Democrat policies? Yeah, probably, okay? But the reality was, a lot of that was driven because of the financial influence of some of those players. Let's take that off the table, because even if you could write a check to make it happen, I hope we're all principled enough in the room, we wouldn't do that, right? Because we want to win on the merit of the debate. So, how do you put pressure at the grassroots level on your legislator? The first thing I would tell you to do is to try to have a relationship with these folks. They're normally not hard to get to know. Your representative here is Cheryl Grossman. She's a personable lady. I hope you have a relationship with her. If you don't, you should. And I don't necessarily mean as a group, although that's helpful. I mean as an individuals. Most of these folks, I was amazed when I got on the city council in Huber Heights. Huber Heights is a town, some of you may know it, some of you may not. It's a suburb of Dayton. We like to think that Dayton was a suburb of us. But we were 40,000 people strong. We had about a $56 million budget. That may not sound big when we're talking about $8 billion deficits, but we were a good-sized town in Montgomery County. When I first met the mayor, God love him, and I mean that. He was like my political grandfather, although I found out I disagreed with him 9 out of 10 times. But he was a Republican, and so I went to see him. This guy had an 8th grade education, knew politics better than he did policy, knew how to kiss a baby and shake a hand, and frankly was not a very good leader. Was as personable as they came, and was starved for attention. Somebody called him up, wanted to have a cup of coffee. I guarantee you he was having a cup of coffee. And if you stroked his hair a little bit and told him what a nice ring he was wearing, you probably just want his heart, okay? Unfortunately for the country, many of our elected leaders maybe aren't quite that bad, but they're that bad. These are not folks that are inaccessible. So to the extent you can have a personal relationship with these folks, that's the best way to influence it, okay? It's gonna help you get through the clutter immediately. If a friend called me, obviously, more than likely they have my personal cell phone number, as opposed to someone I didn't know who tried to get a hold of me. Where did they call? They called the phone number they could find on my website. They called my state house office. And what happened? They got caught by what? Some gatekeeper someplace. Sometimes it was my wife even, okay? Or it was a staffer. It was a campaign staffer. Or it was a state house staffer. What happened to that phone call? It got logged. Absolutely. We cared about what our constituents said. We always did. It got logged. It got placed in the file. If it was really nasty or really strong or or my aide thought that it was really important that I see it, it might even hit my desk, right? Otherwise, it either got logged and my staff made sure that they dealt with the issue, or it became a response letter. And that response letter stacked up, and I'd have 20 to 50 of them every time I walked in the office. I'd sign through them, and I was probably one of the more responsible reps. And I'd even, normally it was I'm on it, being honest, it was a form letter that responded to a set of issues. So if I got 20 emails about education reform, we'd have one that was designed for people who agreed with me, one designed for people who didn't. Now, some of you are thinking, yeah, he's a liar, typical politician. No, it's not like I'd lie to them, but I might change the focus of the paragraph and say, we appreciate your opinion, but I'm a principled guy. So, my view was if I felt really strongly about a subject, my whole district could have been opposed to me. I still was going to vote the way I believed I needed to vote. Your job in a republic, a democratically elected republic, is to throw me out of office, right? Now, that's not what happened to me, by the way. That's another story. But it wasn't my district. It wasn't my district that threw me out of office. It was some inner workings of the party that got me in trouble in the primary. But so I would then sign those letters, and if I saw something that caught my attention, I'd go back to my staff. We'd discuss it. I may even end up calling that constituent. What you don't want to do, if you can help it, is get caught in that. Okay, obviously, because you just become part of the numbers game. Now, let's go to the worst case scenario. What Rebecca was talking about, where we're just rallying. You are part of the numbers game because there's no other way to be. Maybe you can't have a personal relationship either because you really dislike your representative or they really dislike you, or you just can't get to them. You don't know how to get to them. They haven't responded to the call for coffee. Obviously, if this whole room called Cheryl Grossman and said, I want to have coffee in the morning, she couldn't do it with everybody, okay? So to the extent you can have the relationship, great. If you can't and you get caught kind of in the numbers game, there's still effective ways to do this. But I'm just going to be direct. There's no magic elixir to this. There's no silver bullet. There's no word you can put in the email that's going to make them jump. If you call them and say, I'm your constituent and I demand you do X, well, you and 100 and other 10,000 people are maybe saying that, okay? But what does work is unified, consistent, regular messages that are consistent. If you're not getting a response back, let me ask you, were you really writing your legislator to get a response back? Do you really care to get the form letter back that says, I received your letter and that was very nice and I really care about you and please vote for me next time? Or did you send the letter because you're trying to get their attention on a policy issue? You really sent the letter because you're trying to get their attention on a policy issue. Now, I'm not defending legislators who don't respond to their constituents. I'm not saying that there's no room for them to I'm not saying any of that, okay? They should be listening to their constituents. But what the best message that ever was sent that I saw while I was up there was actually from a group that maybe some of you would agree with and some of you don't. When Governor Strickland was going through the budget and we had this major budget impasse and they had closed the gap supposedly and there was $900 million left to be found and yada, 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 I think he tried to pull a quick stunt that backfired on him. Remember, we had gone into, I wouldn't expect you to remember, but I remember, we had gone into temporary budget continuing resolutions just like the federal government's doing now. We were temporarily extending things just to keep the budget talks alive. He proposed major, drastic cuts to the libraries. I don't know how many of you remember that, but the next day, we're not talking about union rallies, we're not talking about sign waving or people defecating in the rotunda that Rebecca and I were talking about that's happened in the Senate Bill 5 debate, okay? And I don't think that, I hope that wasn't our side. If it was, shame on you.
Tuesday I was so depressed and I was the only one there and it wasn't me.
Good for the record, yeah. Yeah, we bring our own porta potties. Yeah, fantastic. It wasn't that. It was simple emails and phone calls. That's all it was, but it was coordinated. And all the libraries had done was send out emails to people like my wife, your classic soccer mom, quote unquote, who goes to the library occasionally, who's conservative. It didn't matter. They just sent out an email and said, hey, we're being cut. And overnight, man, our phones and our emails were just going galore. And let me tell you what happened. When I walked into my office, my aide, a guy named, doesn't matter, I was going to tell you his name, but I can't remember now. My aide looked at me and said, Representative, we're getting slammed. Now, I think he overstated it. I honestly think we'd gotten a couple hundred. But for him, it was huge. All of a sudden, your district's on fire, Representative. We've got to do something. So that literally, though, when I walked in, it immediately became an issue that I was aware of. And what do you think I told him to do? call them all back and tell them that's Governor Strickland's recommendation and call his office. It was a classic pass the buck moment, and it worked fantastically. And the libraries didn't get cut that amount. They got cut some, but they did not get cut the amount. I think the governor had proposed like a 40% cut. I think they ended up like a 10% cut. It was huge. But when that happened, you should have seen the legislators running into action. We were all going back home to our districts, and we were holding town hall meetings inside our libraries. We were meeting with our library directors and assuring them that we were going to fight for their need and yada, yada. I mean, the game started. Now, for me, I could do that with an honest conscience, because while I believe that a lot of government needs to go away, if you're going to cut something, libraries probably isn't where I'd start. I'd probably start with Medicaid or education or many of these other major policy areas. I love the way these politicians, they always pick on the dumbest stuff to cut instead of dealing with the 800-pound gorilla that's in the room. But that's what the governor did, and that's the best example I can give you. Now, in these times, I mean, Senate Bill 5, I guarantee you that's it's 10 times what I was dealing with when the libraries happened. I'll give you another good example, though, in the education debate, where I talked about Governor Strickland introduced this proposal to change education. He severely cut vouchers and charter school funding in the original proposal. And you wouldn't believe the number of moms that came to testify. You wouldn't believe the number of moms who wrote in. Now, what was fantastic wasn't so much their testimony. I gotta be honest with you, this was our side. They were my friends, not personally, but they were my friends policy-wise. After about 2 of them, I could have told you exactly what they were gonna say. Okay? The message didn't change. It wasn't like the committee was hearing something fantastically new, but because of the sheer number, what it showed was you're not getting away with this easily. You continue down this policy path, there's going to be a terrific price to pay at the ballot. Now, they ended up paying a price at the ballot regardless. Case in point is a Democrat representative who was the chairman of the committee that I was ranking on, that shepherded that education policy through the House. The House was Democrat at that time. I was screaming bloody murder the whole time, as you'd expect me to do, for good reason. That particular representative came from a Democrat district, not super Democrat, but Democrat district, a district that we weren't expecting to win in 2010. We took him out, and it wasn't even close. And it was partly on that education policy. He paid the price for sticking with those policies, not listening to those constituents, okay? So getting their attention. Now, to his credit, I think this guy, nobody liked him on our side, but I think this guy actually had a little bit of principle in him. Unfortunately, I think he actually believed the ridiculous policies, and for that, I give him a little bit of respect. But it was the wrong policies, and he paid the price as he should have, and he's now out of office. People see that, okay? And many of the legislators up there just want to stay around, okay? And if they think that you're going to make them pay a price, they're often going to listen. Now, the same goes on the positive side. Now, we're going to see a lot of bills, just like Senate Bill 5, that we believe in, or that we believe in partially, that we want to see passed. And of course, they need to know that you're just as strong advocating and you have their back. If they're naturally inclined because of their party leadership or because of their principles or because of whatever to be for a particular bill, if you can't match the number of union protesters, it's okay, just like what's happened in this particular debate. But man, you need to make sure that they understand you're with them. Even if it's 4-1, 8-1, but if they hear silence on the other end of that phone, the courage that they must muster to pull off votes like that is I mean, I've been there. It's really tough to think that nobody's got your back and still do it. I'll tell one little anecdotal story and then I'll shut up because we are running over. At Huber Heights, there really wasn't a majority party and a minority party. We were technically a nonpartisan council. I had actually formed an alliance with a Democrat council member who was a business owner, extremely conservative on fiscal issues. We had problems financially, not near what they're having today throughout these states, because this was before all the collapse had happened. But the story really goes to tell 2 points. We got tired of asking for efficiencies. We got tired of begging the cops and the firefighters to do more with less, or even dealing with the low-hanging fruit. And so finally, I recommended behind closed doors, because it wasn't something I could do out front immediately, to this guy. We formed an alliance and we said, we're just going to cut taxes in Huber Heights, and we're going to make them do with less. That was the only way we could figure out to get them to be more efficient. A holy war ensued when the administration figured out what we were doing. I mean, we're talking holy war. We're talking they tried to recall us off the council. The unions got engaged. It was tremendously ugly. This was before the Tea Party, okay? There was no one for me to go run into, and for a year this battle happened kind of behind closed doors because neither side was ready to talk about it. I wasn't ready to go out and advocate for a tax decrease because I didn't want to have the public war that quickly, and I was still holding the other council members kind of at bay. It was purely a political strategic decision, and the administration, of course, didn't want to go out and talk about it because who wasn't going to be for a tax decrease when it finally went public? Well, we held off, finally released our plan. Of course, the rest of the mushy council members who didn't know how to respond got on board because they couldn't vote against a tax decrease publicly. The public supported it. But it goes for two reasons. Number one, these budget deficits can be handled. We found 8%, not we, the administration, once they were forced to deal with the reality of less revenue, which we had forced, they found 8% of their general revenue fund, I believe was the number, in 30 days. About a third of it came out of supply budget lines. Now, you can criticize me as a council member and tell me you didn't have your eye on the ball, and you know what, you'd be kind of right. All I can tell you is at $300 a month, at 2 meetings a month, as walking into a department, which our legislators are dealing with. I mean, you think they can walk into the Ohio EPA and immediately be able to spot waste? No. I mean, how do they do that? You think the EPA is going to show them where the waste is at? Not hardly. You think they're all environmental experts? Not hardly. You think I can walk into a fire department and immediately tell where the efficiency problems are at? I might have some ideas, but when you have a fire chief standing up saying, no, we don't have any problem, and if you do that, we're going to have less response time, that's tough. So what did? We pulled the Reagan trick. Okay, up to you guys. But you're going to have less money, and you're going to do it anyway. So when the new administration came in, because we had to fire a bunch of them, and a bunch of them quit because they were all mad at us, which I was happy for, they came in, they found it in 30 days. We can deal with an $8 billion budget deficit. That's the point of the first story. The second point, though, is during that period of time, because there was no Tea Party, because strategically I did not feel comfortable yet releasing the plan, because I wanted to keep these other council members at bay, and it was a very good decision, as it turned out, because we ended up getting the whole thing done. I'll tell you, that was the most alone year of my life. And I think I'm one of the more principled guys you've met in politics, and I'm not bragging. I've got a great wife and a good faith that keeps me grounded. But that was extremely difficult, extremely difficult. There was no place for us to turn. It was me and this Democrat. We knew the game. We were strategizing the whole thing. We had enemies on the other side who knew what we were up to. They were pounding the snot out of us behind the scenes, using every dirty trick they could find in the book. We'd literally call each other up. We talked almost daily during that period of time just to hold each other up. We'd talk to each other, and we'd literally say, I mean, it was either him or me, depending on which one was most down during the day. We'd say, what do you think they're going to do to us? Will you call us? I mean, it can't get any worse, so just blaze ahead, brother. And that's what we kept doing. But that was really difficult. And I think that if it were folks that had less backbone, they would have caved. And so we can't assume that everybody in the game is willing to put their political careers on the line. Although we would like to have that representation, we probably don't in many cases. So it's mightily important for those folks to know that you've got their backs. If they're naturally inclined, again, you may not need to be able to meet the opposition one-to-one, but we better be able to do better than nothing. And many of these reforms, there's major lobbies on the other side, as I use the nursing homes as an example, that have a lot of money and have a lot of ability and long-term relationships with these legislators in many respects that maybe you don't have. So the liberty cause is very much reliant on everyday American people just like you who are suffering from an ever-growing government, suffering from an ever-growing tax, and you need to see that reduced. It's good to come down to you folks. It's going to come down to us folks, not just putting it on your back, to continue to stand up. Because, as Rebecca pointed out earlier, when the money goes in and it comes back out and then it's used against us, that's happening not just with unions, it's happening all throughout the system. So, is that good enough?
That's great.
What questions do you have? Yes, sir. Do we want to? We're officially done.
We're officially done. So if
you keep recording, but I'll stay here all night long. I think this gentleman had his hand up first. I'm sorry. Is that okay?
Is there something that you want to?
Yeah, I wanted to. When you send us these emails and you say click here and this form letter will go to someone. Is it better to do that or to create your own
Well, here's
letter?
the thing, the ones that I send are editable text.
Yeah.
Meaning you can change them if you wanted to. A lot of people don't have time to, or they don't understand the issue, so they just find it easier. And a lot of times it's just the volume they're looking at, because like Seth said, they're not really reading them anyway. I mean, maybe they're keeping count of how many are on each side, maybe not. I agree with you that a personalized letter is a better thing. So if you have the time and you understand the issue, absolutely change the text.
Remember that, I mean, it always impressed me when I get a personalized letter if I didn't know the person, but I still didn't know the person, and so they still got a letter back from my office that may or may not be personalized, okay? I might add a more personal note because of it. But if I didn't know the person, again, I'm not a great example because I normally had my mind made up before the debates even started because I knew what I believed, okay? You might be able to change me some, but it really does come down, if you don't have that personal relationship, it comes down, it's a volume game. They've got to perceive that this is huge. You follow me?
And by the end of it, those of you who sent emails probably noticed that a lot of them just had their autoresponder on. So everybody got the exact same response. So they weren't even reading them.
You get to that level, I mean, like the library, and that was small compared to what you all dealt with in SB5. I mean, there was, the best we could do is just auto-respond. Yeah, we hear you. We love you, we hear you. Call the governor, you know? I'm sorry. I'm not trying to be the keeper of score here, but this gentleman.
I just wondered if there's any way, and you've been there and done that, to get past the gatekeeper. Should we personally go there and say, can I sit down and just chat with my representative for a little while? Can I get on your calendar and to do that?
It's my fault I didn't bring that up.
Yeah.
Yes, I think you should try. I would put that in the category, I'm kind of a methodical guy, of relationship though, okay? But yeah, I think you should try. That's what lobbyists do all day long. The problem with lobbyists, they're not inherently evil either. In many respects, they're advocating sometimes for things you agree with. But they're obviously representing some sort of special interest, whether it's a special interest we like or not. So that happens all day long.
Those guys might need help. Those people might need help from all of us.
Right.
And if we could just go in and say, all right, what can we do to support you in those kinds of things? I think they would just go crazy if they had somebody that wanted to.
Since we're officially done, I'm going to tell another story, if that's okay.
You can tell as many stories as you like.
I just love these little stories. I hope that if they put you to
Are
sleep.
you okay with that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I'll bring you a teddy bear so you can sleep with it. No. I'll give an example where that happened. This was, again, at the city council level. But there was a property tax proposed to go up. It was going to increase the property tax in order to fund a senior center. Now, I love seniors, not mad at seniors. But we were already funding the senior center, and I didn't want to have to vote on a property tax. Now, it was going to be me voting on it, putting it on the ballot. They were trying to make it nice, okay? Well, I was about to run for auditor of the county and, you know, political ramifications, and I had been warned, you vote against this, it's death, you're over, you know, okay. So I called up one of my buddies and I said, I got a problem in Houston. One guy changed the entire community's opinion of the senior center tax. And this is how he did it. We knew I had a political problem because I was going to vote against this thing because I didn't believe in it, okay? And I was going to put myself in political hot water. I called him up. He's a longtime ally of mine. I said, I just need some help. I think he spent $40 of his own money because legally he couldn't do it in an association. Otherwise, it would have been PAC money. And he printed up nothing untruthful. He printed up just little black and white flyers. And he went around the community just one afternoon, and he started, now we're talking a town of 40,000 folks. It's not small. And he started slipping them in windshield wipers and under floor mats. And he just, all it was, remember what I said? What's perception? Reality. And it just said, did you know the city council is about to vote to increase property taxes to expand the Huber Heights Senior Center? Something like that. Okay. What do you think happened to the letters to the editor the next couple of weeks? It wasn't young people saying, and you know, getting in a generational warfare. It was old people saying, how dare you raise my taxes? I'm on a fixed income. If you want to play bridge, do it in your own stupid kitchen. I'm not kidding. And overnight, the entire council dynamic shifted. All the people that were for it, it never came out of committee. It never went to a vote. Everybody knew who was behind it. My fingerprints weren't on it at all, but now it's on video. And I just sat in the back room and twiddled, you know, and the debate was over. There may be opportunities, you know, in these fights with over estate tax. I mean, these are statewide campaigns. It's hard for us to It's hard for us to wrap our heads around the complexity of that entire argument. But you know what? Local issues and even the big state issues in your community. If Cheryl Grossman gets the feeling, because the letters to the editor are a little different, perception's reality. It's going to give her all the more courage to be stronger and go further in those debates. I've been in the leadership room, okay? I was the policy chairman for our caucus, and I got to serve inside the leadership room. And that's kind of a sanctified place. It's really not. But I'm not going to get into a lot of details because that was all very confidential. It was the 4 or 5 members of the Republican caucus who would debate what we needed to do. But let me tell you, it's not just the support for the bill you're after. It's the intensity of the support for the bill that you're after. And the perception that you can create for their realities will help increase the intensity of their support. The reason SB 5 turned into something that wasn't as strong as what we had hoped it was is because the intensity of the support just wasn't there in the Senate caucus. I'm not blaming us. I'm frankly surprised they got it out of the Senate at all. That's great news, okay? But it's not just the issue, it's the intensity of the support. Estate tax is a great example where we're going to see that again. Do we repeal it completely, or do we repeal it with the municipal and township exclusion? That's going to come down to the intensity of the support for the issue.
Well, my question is basically the same as his. I just like to point, I mean, we've written these letters. I'm wondering if it would help to have like a small group go down to, you know, Ted Celeste's office and say, you know, these are some of the issues we're interested in supporting, rather than just sending him an email or sending him a letter.
I wish I could.
Possible.
No, I wish I could. It's going to be better than sending the letter, okay? Because Ted's going to say to himself, "Wow, that was really nice. They must care a little more because they came down." I wish I could promise you that somehow is going to change. You know,
It won't change it.
it may or may not change it. It may make him more receptive to take a phone call from you. That's really important. Probably won't change his mind because I think he's actually one of the more principled members of their caucus, which makes him harder to deal with because he's very liberal. But that's great. I mean, it's better to have that relationship. So sure, anything you can do, you know, the personal letter, if you have the time to do it, instead of the non-personal letter, that's better. But at the end of the day, it's really about creating that perception.
I would say also that at this point, the impression that I'm having from a lot of legislators is that they do want to have a good relationship with Tea Party people and AFP people because they think that when it comes time for their reelection, they want us to have their backs. And so...
or not be so mad at them that we make them #1 target.
Exactly. Or run someone against them. So they are trying hard at this point, some of them, not all, obviously, to make us happy. And so the day, the 17th, when we were all down there were 2 senators who had been on the fence, and we took a bunch of people to their offices, and 2 of them on the spot said, "I'll support it." So, I mean, I don't know if they plan to do that already or not, but it was effective that day.
The first rumors out of our district was that my senator, Senator Peggy Lehner, was not supportive of SB 5. Our local Tea Party president went in with about 20 Tea Partiers and pinned her and said, "Where are you at?" And she said, "I'm voting for the bill."
Yeah, I was in one of those meetings too. It wasn't
Really?
my senator, but I was in one with Jimmy Stewart, and he came out and said, "Yes, I'm going to vote for it."
I mean, did she make up her mind right there on the spot? I don't know, but it doesn't help to have 20 of her constituents staring her in the face and
Right.
asking questions. Go ahead.
Seth, you know, I don't think I really understand collective bargaining in that, you know, a public servant has 2 things going for them. They have a sanctioned monopoly, essentially. They're protected by civil service. And so what's the big hubbub on collective bargaining? Is it the implied threat of a strike? I mean, sure, the police say they are prevented from striking, but that doesn't stop the blue flu from showing up and exercising that kind of power. So I'm not sure when the union, in regards to SB 5, talks about collective bargaining, I don't think I really understand what it is they're talking about.
Why they're so upset about it?
Yeah.
Is that what you mean?
I mean, just their jobs are pretty much protected. They got civil service protection. They've already been treated more than fairly based on the numbers. What is it about collective bargaining that seems to be such a problem for them?
You know, I probably had more Go ahead.
The one thing, I was actually trying to read the bill last weekend, like all 260-some pages. It's basically revised, the Ohio Revised Code and all the changes. And the biggest changes I noticed as far as the education was that it said length of service cannot be the only determinant if you're having a reduction in force. And pay raises are to be merit-based. In other words, you don't automatically get your step raise because you lasted another 3 years. You get it maybe because you are at that so many years service and you're maybe, the merit can be shown that, okay, yeah, you deserve it. You've done a good job. You've got, it's merit-based.
The unions are getting.
And that's a change. It used to be just automatic, just because were breathing.
There's a lot of misinformation going to the union members. For example, I think it's Senator Faber testified yesterday, and in his testimony he was talking about, I think it was him, I'm not sure, there was a senator who was for the bill who testified and said, my wife is a teacher. And the unions are telling her that if this passes, that her salary will be cut by half. And that's just not true.
Well,
but that's what they're doing, they're telling people that.
Yeah, there was a pay scale in there.
Yeah.
And I think that's what they're talking about, because the Dublin teachers union was, distributing this among their members, saying this is what your pay scale is going to be. 10 years and a master's degree, you get $38,000 max. The thing just before that, it said and this was, I don't know how many years ago that it was from, and it says teachers in Ohio shall not be paid less than. It was a minimum.
I think the entire union community, specifically in this case the public unions, view this as step one, okay? I think we would be the same way if we were on the other side of the debate and we saw, healthcare reform. Is it as draconian as some people have made it into the law itself?
Yes.
Perhaps not.
No,
It is.
But it is, and if it's not already there, it's headed there, okay, right? And that's the truth. That's where it's headed. So I think partly they view it as step one. But the other thing you have to realize is they have tremendous power inside local government. When the union leadership spoke in Huber, and again, I just told you some stories about Huber, we bucked up to them. But when they spoke, man, you should have seen the council members running for the hills, because they brought not a ton of money to those campaigns, but they brought boots on the ground. And who wants to be opposed to a teacher or a police officer or a firefighter? It didn't happen. So this is, if the local governments are given the ability to hire around them, because they won't arbitrate or they won't deal with the system that Rebecca described earlier, then their power shrinks dramatically in those conversations. And there's like 5 hands popping up here. So I think this guy, in fact, sorry.
This is just a follow-up to what George said. There's no collective bargaining right in the Bill of Rights. Collective bargaining is totally new within the last century. Matter of fact, the Wagner Act gives an exemption to unions. Unions are cartels. We make them illegal in every other industry except for the label industry. More importantly, and the one letter you guys should get and send out to everybody, is FDR was vehemently opposed to public service unions. These are government unions working against the public people. The public unions didn't come in until the 60s, and it was done by JFK on an executive order to undermine the democratic process. These state unions didn't come around to the 70s. So we're acting like this has been a right since the beginning. It's like one of the 10 Commandments. It's not. These are new things. But the most important message is, within my lifetime, I've watched these public service unions take a great country and almost run it into the ditch. That's what we're up against. These these unions, if left alone, will literally bankrupt this country. And it's because we've removed the arm's length dealing. When you're dealing with a union in a private sector, the owner of that business has a real incentive to fight against you. Now you have someone negotiating with someone who owes their allegiance to the person you're negotiating with. This is no longer a competition, it's an agreement on how to extort as much money as you can out of the taxpayers. We don't have anyone fighting for the taxpayers. We have politicians owing their allegiance to the unions, dealing with people, dealing with the unions, all to sit there and pass laws to pass higher bills upon the taxpayers. Government unions have no place in the American system. Even FDR will tell you that.
Criminal enterprise.
I gotta step in. Everything that you guys have said is correct, and everything that Robert just said is correct, and everything you said is correct. But you guys have all fallen into the trap, and this is what organizations like yours have got to do to correct. Okay? This bill is not about collective bargaining. Okay? Perception is reality. If you go out into the public and you ask them about various different pieces in this bill, and those of us that pay attention know that the real power in SB 5 is not the $1.3 billion at the state budget, it's allowing the local governments to cut into their costs so that Kasich can close the budget by cutting the supply to the local governments. We all know that.
Yes.
But you guys are all falling right into the trap. The one thing that the public thinks, and I say think because if you actually talk to them and explain to them why collective bargaining is a really, really bad idea in the public sector, they agree with you. But the public thinks that is the one thing that is unfair. So that is the one thing that the union protesters are out at these rallies, that's what they're rallying about. But we all know that it is step one because what they're really after is the union dues to address what he's talking about because the system's corrupt.
Exactly.
But they're not going to talk about union dues because anybody who looks and thinks for half a second and says, well, wait a minute, I'm paying taxes, they're giving it to these people, these giving to these people, and these people are paying to get these people elected. We can all see there's a word for that, it's corruption, it's theft. It's as simple. By playing into this thing of saying, you know, it's well, everything he just said is correct. But they're out there yelling about collective bargaining because it's the one thing that the public perception thinks is unfair in this bill. But it's probably one of the least important aspects to the bill.
I had a conversation with a senator today who's a friend, and I had this conversation with Rebecca over coffee before we came here. My personal opinion is I wish that we would have delayed this debate until the budget, because then you could have put the conversation in the context of an $8 billion budget deficit. That the Ohio people, I think, are going to very quickly understand. And to view it as a reform, to your point, to help correct that budget deficit. But that didn't happen. We don't control that, and we've got to support the reforms that are coming out.
But you're right. We did a poll, a statewide poll, and if you ask people, do you think that state employees should have collective bargaining rights, the majority of them will say yes, and the reason is because they don't understand what collective bargaining means. Because then if you say, do you think that people should be forced to be in a union or they should be able to choose, like 85% say they should be able to choose, right? And if you ask, should the union dues go for political purposes, they would say no, because you're absolutely right. We have to change how we talk about it, and that's the only way we're going to win this debate, especially when it goes to referendum.
It's whoever shouts loudest wins, and they're saying this, I give them one thing, these unions credit, they decide what the message is going to be, and that's it.
They're a whole lot more disciplined than we are.
They are.
They do not stray off message, and and collective bargaining is such a trivial aspect to this bill of where it's actually going. And the unions know what the deal is. They're not stupid. They know exactly where the money is. But if we continue to play into this and make these big deals and forget what they're talking about, talk what we need to talk about. We need to get out there and tell people what the real problem is, as you just said. Should people be forced to pay union dues? No.
I think there's one other argument that we can make for public sector employees. This would not apply to private sector employees. And that is how right is it for you, and Rebecca commented on this, but if you think about this in a way of arguing, again, as you engage in debate, how right is it for me to have to belong to AFSCME to work for a taxpayer-funded organization? That inherently conflicts if you start to think about the implications of that from a public policy standpoint. Now, that's very different than a local contractor deciding I'm employing union members from the union hall to put up studs. That's different.
I think the biggest argument is they're a monopoly.
Well, there should be no public
There
hearings,
should be no
period.
union
There
where
should
there's
be
a monopoly
none.
because they can't lose anything.
I would really like to encourage these guys who are on the radio, because I can't, I'm sort of under the radar because I'm a school employee. I don't really.
You don't videotape.
But those who are on the radio, any union member, I'm a fair share fee payer. So I get the portion of my dues that are considered to be non-chargeable. In other words, they're for political purposes. I get that rebated to me.
But
Any school, any
help
public.
me though, that's very small, right? You're not getting much back. I'm not certain how they're valuing it. But you're carved out. You're different than most of these unions.
But I thought that any, well, I guess we're represented by AFSCME.
I'm not certain that's true for every state employee.
I don't think it is.
Because I know there was a teacher who elected to become a fair share fee payer after the local Democrats trashed a candidate who was a Republican and conservative and happened to be her husband. And then she got really upset with her union, and she's now a fair share fee payer.
I'm not arguing with you. I just want the folks to know I'm not certain that's true.
I would encourage anybody who's a union member to look into the possibility of becoming a fair share fee payer and it's a way of taking some money away from the Democrats.
But you're absolutely right, that is the elephant in the room that no one is talking about, and we need to start talking about it.
You guys fight over it.
Is there any redress to the 6 Republicans that voted with the Democrats, in your opinion, that we should do, or should we just forget about it, or should we, is there some form of activity we can engage in to point out the error of their ways? Because it's tiring for me to see Republicans fold their tent like a cheap suit.
Yeah.
When under a little bit of opposition. The Democratic Party, you got to give them credit, they're 100% over there. 100%. And they do that time and time again.
You know, that's a really strategic question. I mean, you can do the blast thing, okay? You can just send them all emails that say how disappointed you are with their decision. I mean, that's easy, that can be done, no big deal. If you really want to take some blood, Janet Napolitano, I mean that in a very proverbial way. If you really want to deal with like making a measurable impact, what I would encourage is that you target one of these guys or gals. That you target them, and that you're going to have to do that in a coordinated way. This is a conversation Rebecca and I have been having with other leaders across the state.
I'll give you an easy example. When we did November's Coming last year, we did it for national candidates, but this year, next time, I'm sure we'll probably do it for state candidates. You know, I went on 6 bus tours across the state, educating people about how specific Congress members had voted on 3 specific issues. We distributed 80,000 pieces of literature educating people. We did thousands of volunteer phone calls educating people about how these people voted. And so what I would say, in my opinion, the best thing to do is to not let people forget how these 6 people voted, to keep it in the forefront of the public debate. And if these 6 members continue down this path, then, you know, I'll be calling you in November, you know, August, to say, AFP doesn't support or oppose candidates, but we certainly educate people on how those candidates voted.
Okay, my turn to add it, and I get more than 3 minutes too. Everybody, hey, everybody in the room, everybody in the room already knows what the problem is. You already know what the answer is. Now here's the problem I see, and here's what we got to do. We got no stinking leadership in this state when it comes to the Republican and the conservative side. Sure, John Casey got elected, but where in the hell's his backup? You saw what these 6 rhinos led by Jim Hughes just did. They sold out Kasich to try and save their neck in their district or whatever. We need to stand up to these schoolyard bullies, and we got nobody. Who's the leadership of this state? We ain't got no stinking leadership with the Tea Party. In the 912, we're like a bunch of little mice a bunch of times. I mean, you know, we got a nice deal going on tonight and stuff like that. I'll tell you who the real leadership is, and there's 4 of them right in this room tonight. Roy Wagner, Tomato George, West Side Bob, and myself. We've done more to kick the union thugs and the Democrats and Obama than any 20 or 30 groups in this stinking state, and that's a plain fact. If you want to have a difference and make a difference, you need to get out and get vocal and stand up to these bunch of hoods, just like what's went on down here at the State House. Call them what they are. Now, Glenn Beck's doing a hell of a job, and he's documenting everything, but I think he kind of, you know, pansies around a little bit. But Rush Limbaugh, really, when you want to talk about leadership, who's anybody more fiery and gets the message across than Rush Limbaugh, because he's got the facts behind him. Am I right or wrong? That's why he has a powerful message when he calls up, and what he does, and George and myself. We call up and we've got the facts behind us, and we put it right on the line, and we tell it like it is. And these guys can't go up against us, but it takes somebody with some courage and backbone. We got a guy right here, Roy Wagner, that's documented all this. I mean, you look at the library and the volume of work that Roy Wagner's done to document all this. Who's ever went up against us and beat us in a debate or anything, Bob?
I will say Dave did a hell of a job stopping the arena, though. You're going to credit anyone for stopping that arena.
You know, what Rebecca said, what you just said is very right. I mean, when you do start to shed light and keep this in the forefront of the voter's mind, it's pretty easy to change the debate.
Well, and you've hit on something. That's why I'm telling you right now, we have to have one message, and it's got to be a message that everybody hits on. Remember, it's the dawn of a new era. There's new kids on the block, and that's the new media coming on down the street. You don't have to rely on get the message out with the old media, because nobody's even paying attention to it.
I would just say that certainly there's a lot to be heeded to. I'm not certain I'm good on camera to say I agree with everything you just said. But I said it. No, but let's remember that I believe we as a movement need to stand for the principles of liberty, and that being our focus will call out those Democrats who are using and gaming the system for their own regard, like they have in Cuyahoga County.
Yep.
Amanda, did you nail that? And the Republicans who have used and abused the system for their own regard. We've got to remember that in many cases, some of these, I mean, it was what, 2 years ago that we controlled, well, no, we didn't control everything. It was 4 years ago we controlled everything in Ohio. It was 4 years ago that we had Taft and Speaker Husted and Senate President Harris, and we had these great budget plans and yada, 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 and this is what we're dealing with now. Ted Strickland didn't usher in an $8 billion deficit. Now, he didn't help the deficit he inherited, but he didn't usher it in, okay? He was horrific. He was absolutely horrific. He was sitting on the sidelines. He was letting it get worse. He was a whole lot worse than what we had before. But the fact is, it was poor leadership. It was special interests that allowed to get us to that point in the first place. And so now, to Rebecca's point earlier, to your point, we've got a fantastic opportunity. The problem is so big, and this is where I get kind of excited, not that the problem's so big, but because the problem is so big, some of the people who are lacking in leadership otherwise are recognizing they have no choice if they want to look like they have solutions, but to have big answers. Now's the chance we have to fix this.
And I voted for Strickland because I was sick and tired of the way that DeWine was screwing the farmers in the Union County over this wetlands crap, and paid no attention to the people whose ox was getting gored, but his buddies down in the State House there, and we don't need no more rhinos. That's why I voted for Strickland, and I also voted for Kasich.
Thank you for voting for Casey.
Yes, thank you.
Well, you know, just as a concluding thought. Pardon me?
Tomato George.
Yeah. You know, the real power is you had 10,000 of the union establishment downtown. And it could have been 100,000, it doesn't matter. How big the size and intensity, and you're right about intensity, is important. But you know what? It boils down to the number of votes that you can get. And those guys were from all across the country, and they import them in and by the busloads, as you mentioned. And so what really, the strength we have is our ability to organize and educating ourselves locally in groups just like this 912 group right here in Hilliard. If you can expand your sphere of influence by a coefficient of two or three times, that's 2 or 3 times the vote that's going to show up and make some difference. And you got a big pool of opportunity. 50% of the people out there aren't even registered to vote. And I know that most Americans live their lives in a conservative fashion. And so the objective is for us to help folks like this and get behind the conservative legislators that we have to give them that kind of support. And it's always nice to have that high visibility down at the State House, but where it really counts, where the rubber hits the road, is on Election Day. That's right. And if we build our strength up and educate ourselves and bring our friends to meetings and explain how important it is to grasp these issues and to show up and vote, we will win at the end of the day.
You know what I want to echo on that is, it often looks like this is such an insurmountable problem, and they have so many people and we don't. But you're absolutely right. If we'll just deal with our own backyard, with our own neighborhood, everybody will do that. Then we're covered, if everybody will do it.
And the problem is not Democrat or Republican. The problem is we have failed to stick with the values and principles upon which this country was founded. And that's what's gone wrong.
No, I agree. It's not a Democrat or Republican problem. Both sides agree.
The healthcare debate, I think, is a perfect example of what you said, though, as well. I didn't expect throughout the summer. I mean, if people would ask me, do you think they're going to repeal healthcare, and I'd say no. I think it was the intensity of the election results that caused them to follow through with it. And that's a great way to do it.
Thank you guys for listening.
All right. Yeah, good.